Chapter 5. Property in Ancient Greece. 1. The evolution of the Attic state and land laws. Ancient Athens. One of the most sophisticated early transitions from blood-based communalism to territory-based private ownership. The birth of the Athenian state wasn't peaceful evolution. It was structural revolution, shattering the ancient gens, the matrilineal clan. The cornerstone, transformation of land, from sacred, inalienable tribal heritage into commercial asset that could be mortgaged, sold, concentrated in the hands of a new aristocracy. In earliest Athens, land was still held by the various gentes and phratries. There was profound religious connection to the soil, where ancestors were buried, where sacred hearths burned. But as maritime trade expanded and money became widespread, the old tribal logic failed. The Attic state arose to manage a new reality, a population no longer organized by kinship, but by where they lived and how much wealth they possessed. Athens's land laws were the first in history to codify alienability of the soil, meaning land could finally be separated from the family, treated as a commodity. This legal shift had devastating consequences for common people. Under the new laws, if a peasant couldn't pay his debts, his land could be seized by the creditor. This introduced the hypotheca, the mortgage. A stone pillar, a Horos, was placed on a field, signifying the land was pledged to a wealthy moneylender. This was the moment when freedom of the soil died. Land, which had once supported the entire community, was now burdened with debt and private interest. These land laws reflect the broader Greek transition, from military democracy of equal kinsmen to plutocracy of wealthy landowners. The state didn't arise to protect ancient communal rights. It arose to protect the new private titles, to enforce contracts of creditors. By the time of the Great Reforms, the Attic landscape was no longer a tapestry of shared tribal groves. It was a fragmented map of private estates. The individual Athenian citizen now stood alone before the law, protected in his private ownership if he were rich, but enslaved by the very same laws of property if he were poor. This tension between right to property and social stability would define Greek political struggles for centuries. 2. The transition from family groups, gens, to the city, polis. The story of how blood was defeated by territory and property. In the Homeric age, Greeks were still organized into clans, land held in common by the kin group. But as Athenian population grew and trade expanded, this ancient system fractured. The gens was a closed organic unit. It couldn't survive the influx of foreigners and the rise of money-based economy. The birth of the polis, the city-state, was the administrative solution. But it required total redefinition of what it meant to own. The ancient gens didn't know the concept of citizen in the political sense. You were either a member of the family or a stranger. The polis needed to organize people for war and taxation. It replaced old tribal divisions by territorial ones. Land was divided into demes, districts. A man was no longer defined by his ancestors, but by the piece of ground he lived on and the wealth he extracted from it. This territorialization was the death knell for communal property. Once land was mapped and assigned to individuals within a district, the community's ancient unwritten claim to the soil vanished. This transition was also a religious revolution. In the old system, land was owned by family spirits and ancestors. You couldn't sell land because you didn't own the souls buried in it. But the polis introduced a secular, legalistic view of the earth. The city-state needed land to be mobile, something that could be bought, sold, used as collateral, to fund the burgeoning maritime trade. The sacred grove was replaced by the private estate. The priest was replaced by the magistrate. The move to the polis created a new social hierarchy based on landholdings rather than lineage. In the gens, even the poorest member was co-owner of tribal heritage. In the polis, if you lost your land to debt or trade, you lost your standing as citizen. Property became the ticket of entry into political life of the city. This led to proletarianization of the masses. Those who were once secure in their communal kinsgroup were now free individuals, free to own, but also free to be homeless. The city-state was built on the ruins of the clan, and its foundation was the newly minted private title deed. 3. The influence of money and usury on rural existence. The introduction of coined money into agrarian Greece was like dropping corrosive acid onto an ancient tapestry. Until the 7th century BCE, the Greek peasant lived in a world of natural economy, wealth measured in grain, wine, and oil, social obligations fulfilled through mutual aid within the gens. But with the rise of Lydian coinage and expansion of maritime trade, property underwent a terrifying transformation. It became quantifiable, mobile, and most importantly, subject to usury. Money became the commodity of commodities, a secret power that could bypass ancient tribal laws of inalienability. For the first time, a farmer didn't just owe a portion of his harvest to his kin, he owed value to a distant creditor. When bad harvests struck, or costs of military equipment became too great, the citizen had to provide his own. The small landowner was forced to turn to wealthy aristocracy for loans. These loans weren't neighborly gestures, they were trapdoors into the abyss of usury. The primary tool of this economic warfare? The Horos, the mortgage stone. A creditor would place a stone pillar on the debtor's land, inscribed with the amount of debt and the lender's name. This stone was physical sign that the unity of the soil had been broken. The peasant still lived on the land, but he was no longer its master. He was a tenant on his own ancestral earth, working primarily to pay off an interest rate that grew faster than the crops. This was the birth of absentee ownership, where wealth of the countryside flowed into coffers of city merchants. The ultimate horror of this system? The debt wasn't just secured by the land, it was secured by the person. If the land wasn't enough to satisfy the usurer, the debtor and his children could be sold into slavery to pay the balance. Property had reached a stage where it could consume its own creator. The free kinsman of the old gens was transformed into a thing to be sold in Mediterranean marketplaces. This crisis of usury and concentration of land into the hands of a few eupatriots, the well-born, brought Athens to the brink of bloody civil war. It proved that private property, when coupled with money and interest, acts as a centrifugal force, flinging the poor into destitution and the rich into absolute power. Rural existence, once protected by sacred commonality of the tribe, was now a battlefield of ledgers and liens. 4. Solon's reforms and the classification by wealth. By 594 BCE, Athens was a powder keg of social unrest. Uncontrolled expansion of usury and brutal enforcement of debt laws had created a society where the majority was either enslaved or living in fear of the Horos stones. At this breaking point, Solon, a merchant poet of noble birth, was granted extraordinary powers to reform the state. His mission wasn't to abolish property, but to save it from its own excesses, by introducing the first social contract based on wealth classification. Solon's first and most radical act was the hypotheca, the shaking off of burdens. He didn't redistribute the land, that would have alienated the aristocracy, but he did something almost as revolutionary. He canceled all existing debts and prohibited the practice of using one's own body as collateral for a loan. This act effectively emancipated the person from being property. However, to maintain state stability, he introduced a new system of political participation, based strictly on property tiers, rather than ancient bloodlines of the gens. Under Solon's code, citizens were divided into 4 classes based on annual yield of agricultural products, measured in medimnoi. First, the pentakosi medimnoi, those who produce 500 units or more. They held the highest offices and greatest military responsibilities. Second, the hippies, the knights who produced 300 units. They could afford to keep a horse for war. Third, the zeugetai, the yokemen who produced 200 units. They served as heavy infantry, hoplites. Fourth, the thets, the laborers who produced less or owned no land. They had no right to hold office, but gained the right to vote in the assembly and serve on juries. This was a monumental shift in the history of the state. For the first time, the rights and duties of citizens were determined according to the amount of their landed property. The old tribal aristocracy of birth was replaced by an aristocracy of wealth. Property was no longer just a means of survival, it was the legal yardstick of a man's value to the city. By quantifying citizenship through grain and oil, Solon codified the plutocratic principle. While Solon saved the poor from slavery, he anchored the state firmly in the logic of accumulation. Land was still private, but the polis now managed it through a census. This system ensured that those with the most at stake, the largest property owners, held the most power, creating a model for republican governance that would influence Rome, and eventually the modern world. The Attic state was no longer a family, it was a corporation of shareholders, where the size of your share determined the volume of your voice. 5. Military democracy and its foundation in property. The final consolidation of the Athenian state was cemented by a unique social contract, the link between private property and military service. In the transition from old tribal world to classical polis, citizenship wasn't a natural right given at birth. It was a status earned through possession of the means to defend the city. This created what historians call a military democracy, where the degree of one's property determined one's place on the battlefield, and consequently one's voice in the assembly. The centerpiece of this system was the hoplite, the heavy infantryman. To be a hoplite, a citizen had to provide his own panoply, a full set of bronze armor, a shield, and a spear. Because the state didn't provide equipment, the ability to serve in the most prestigious and decisive part of the army was restricted to the zeugatai, the class of farmers who owned enough land to afford the costly gear. This created direct correlation between landed property and political sovereignty. If you had the property to protect the soil, you had the right to rule the soil. This foundation in property led to a specific type of social psychology. The Athenian citizen viewed his farm not just as a source of income, but as his stake in the collective survival of the city. Military maneuvers and land laws were two sides of the same coin. When the polis went to war, it was essentially a corporation of landowners marching to protect their private estates. This created a very rigid form of democracy. While it was equal among property owners, it entirely excluded the landless thetes from high office, despite their crucial role as rowers in the Athenian navy. Furthermore, this military property nexus acted as a barrier against concentration of land for a time. To maintain a large army of hoplites, the city needed a large number of independent, medium-scale farmers. If too much land were concentrated in the hands of a few aristocrats, the number of citizens who could afford armor would shrink, weakening the city's defense. Therefore, the military democracy required a balance of property to ensure state survival. With the end of this stage, the transition from gens to state was complete. Property was no longer a fluid communal resource of the kinsman. It was the ironclad foundation of the soldier-citizen. The individual was now tethered to the city through his title deed and his shield.